I'm Don Scavia, the director of the Graham Sustainability Institute and special counsel to President Coleman for sustainability. I want to welcome you all to the 2010 Earth Day Teach-In. I hope you had a chance to look at the historical video that was back there and maybe watch it all the way to the end. Because in the very end, the person being interviewed, the tall guy with the dark sideburns, was in fact Dave Allen, professor of School of Natural Resources and Environment, who is still here with us. Will be joining us a little bit later today, hopefully, during one of our panel sessions. I also want to thank John Russell, who you probably saw in the video, for actually saving these iconic posters for 40 years and bringing them here for us to share. Dave and John and others were part of a group that organized the first Earth Day Teach-In here in 1970, where 15,000 people gathered here on campus to make the world know that, to quote a film of that era, they were mad as hell and they weren't going to take it anymore. I asked Dave earlier this week, what is it that we have to do to get 15,000 people here for this event? And he said, well, that's easy. Watch the video. All you need is a car and a bunch of sledgehammers to get that. I also think weed was involved, but we didn't want to talk about that. So while the environment continues to be really important for our generations and the people coming behind us, the issues are much more complex and complicated now than they were back then. For example, back then the Cuyahoga River was catching on fire and raw sewage was flowing into our waterways. It was pretty clear where the pollution was coming from and pretty clear what we needed to do to fix that. Water pollution is still a problem, but it comes from diffuse sources like farm fields, parking lots, contaminated dust from the atmosphere from the vast air sheds. And we're dealing with a whole new class of biological pollution. You saw the giant carp down the hallway here. These invasive species are a new kind of biological pollution that we didn't have to deal with back then. Back then, we had visible and disturbing plumes of soot and smoke pouring from industrial stacks, and focused a lot of attention on the human health aspects, human health of the local communities and the workers. And today, one of the most important atmospheric pollution is something that's normally as benign as carbon dioxide, and the entire planet is at risk. Back then, Ralph Nader was warning us of cars that were unsafe at any speed. Today, Toyotas pick their own speeds without warning. Back then, NGOs were virtually unheard of and generally powerless. Today, NGOs and nonprofits are among the most powerful voices in the debate, on equal footing with big business and big government. And this is, given where we are in the health reform debate going on right now, this is actually unbelievable. Back then, environmental laws were passed with bipartisan support. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, that created EPA and the requirement to actually analyze the environmental impacts on major projects, passed the Senate unanimously. Just think about that. And Richard Nixon's first official act of the 1970s was to sign that bill into law. And Nixon, the great Republican, signed virtually all the important environmental laws that are ruling what we deal with today: Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. Today, politicians read crib notes from their hand. Environmental protection is increasingly viewed as a Democrat ideal, and portions of those fundamental laws are being gutted by court decisions and lack of enforcement. So clearly, the political arena is quite different now, much more complex and complicated and challenging than it was back then. And then finally, the reporter in the video at the very end asked Dave Allen if the teach-in was, quote, an intellectual panty raid on the establishment. Organizers of the day were against the man and trusted no one over 30. Well, today, most of the panelists, especially me, are way over 30. And I guess some of us could be considered the man. But we're all in it together here. This teaching is more about collective action among students, faculty, staff, and the community, young and old, in and out of the establishment, because we're all in this together. So I just wanted to welcome you with those thoughts about the differences between then and now. We're going to have each one of the Graham PhD fellows that were moderating the panel groups come up and give a short summary of what was discussed in their panels. And then we're going to open it up for a conversation with the panelists. I've got some questions. You probably have some questions. So we all here? We all are here. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Don. I moderated the panel on sustainable accessibility, and our panelists were Dr. Irv Selmeen, Dr. Peter Sweatman, and Dr. Jonathan Levine, who had to leave. And we tried to stick to our script and our three questions throughout the panel and discussion. And so each of the panelists focused on what the challenges were related to accessibility and mobility. And we talked about three primary challenges. The first being us as individuals and what we value as consumers and what our preferences are, which is currently for big, heavy vehicles in many instances that can go quite fast, even though there isn't necessarily a need for all of that performance. The second being that travel is cheap and that we have a massive investment in and a low marginal cost related to our current transportation infrastructure and relatively cheap fuel. And the third being a focus on mobility as an end and not just as a means to meeting that end. In terms of what is being done, we actually spent less time on this area, but we did talk about the fact that there are many little things being done in a somewhat piecemeal fashion, including Peter mentioned a move towards autonomous vehicles and connectivity among vehicles, as well as smaller urban vehicles. But what we did spend more time talking about was what needs to change, and here we focused on the fact that there is no one best way, but a need to allow many things to develop. One big objective being livable cities, social innovation that meets our needs and allows for what Irv was calling a cool factor related to transportation options that aren't necessarily individual vehicles. And also a need for social innovation in transportation policy, not technical innovation alone. And here the conversation switched a bit more and focused to the role of accessibility and demoting mobility to a means of access. And so reaching focus on accessibility both by reducing needs, the need for movement, reducing some impacts of personal transportation, and by redefining those needs so that the goal is really accessing the end objective and not moving necessarily to meet that objective. And I'll stop there, and I believe the panelists will be answering further questions later.
I was moderating the Great Lakes Water Resources panel with Dr. Alan Burton, Dr. Tom Johengen, and Andy Buxbaum, who earlier today I gave an honorary doctorate to. So congratulations again. You're welcome. So in our discussion in the context of the three particular questions. One, what are the fundamental challenges? And the challenges we discussed included sources of pollution, so point versus non-point sources. Whereas point sources might be like a wastewater treatment plant, and non-point sources would be agriculture or runoff from home lawns. And so the point sources, a lot of problems are nutrients, or have been nutrients in the past, but non-point sources, also from agriculture, nutrients are a problem. And from homes, residential property, pesticides are also a problem. We talked about invasive species. Obviously, you've seen the carp, hopefully, down the hall, but we talked about zebra mussels and the Asian carp. And I heard a statistic for the first time that there's, on average, since 1950, new invasive species in the Great Lakes every 28 weeks. It's an interesting number. A little scary. And then we talked about impacts on human-dominated watersheds, like things like habitat alteration. In terms of what's impeding our progress towards sustainability and water resources in the Great Lakes, it's been identified that there's a lack of coordination, and another number that was put out there is there are 140 different programs focused on the Great Lakes, and there's just a severe deficiency in coordination among these groups. There's also a problem in the way we frame our challenges, and this is actually a problem in all aspects of sustainability. I think that we frame the problem and we often put the environment against something like economics. And so for the Asian carp, we talked about, we made it a problem of us versus them, or Michigan versus Illinois, or we made it a problem of the environment versus economics because we wanted to close the locks and shut down shipping. And that's not necessarily the best way to frame the challenge we're facing. We also talked about the need for better understanding of ecosystem scale interactions, and two of our panelists who can answer questions obviously are from Seiler, and they do a lot of that research. And then how do we get there? So how do we address these challenges? We discussed a little bit about maybe learning from some of the lessons of the Chesapeake and the Everglades, not just what to do, but also what not to do. We talked about facilitating communication and sharing data among organizations and agencies that are with similar interests in terms of protecting the Great Lakes and preserving the Great Lakes. And toward the end, we had a bit of optimism when we were talking about the Chesapeake and the Everglades, and it was stated that we're not that bad yet. So the Great Lakes are having problems, and I think another number was they're at 20% of productivity, and I believe that was for plankton. But we're not as bad as it could be, and there's hopefully still time. So.
I moderated the climate and energy panel, and it was incredible. I have never been amongst panelists that honest, and it really, really felt like a teach-in. So I'm gonna kind of divert away from the format of questions that we were supposed to answer, and just kind of talk about what the professors, what their thoughts were on what they chose to talk about. So Professor Carl Simon talked about how the energy problem is more likely than not a sociological and behavioral problem. And a few interesting facts on that are that peak oil production in the United States actually was 40 years ago, and in the world it's going to come in the next 10 years. And so there's been a lot of talk about energy independence regards oil, but currently, 60% of the oil is being imported, whereas 40 years ago, during the first Earth Day, it was about 22%. So there's clearly a huge behemoth to work against there. In the end, though, Professor Simon concluded, and I do feel I agree with him. He answered the question, will technology save our butts again? And the answer is probably not. So in terms of biofuels and the complex systems that interact with biofuels, they'll probably optimistically provide about 25% of the United States energy needs. Hydrogen production, basically the energy that's going to go into producing the hydrogen will completely offset any of the benefits that hydrogen will gain from using hydrogen. And in particular, in Michigan, wind energy is potentially likely to provide only 4 to 5% of Michigan's energy needs. Professor Pollack talked about climate change in the context of what we've already committed to regarding, with respect to the emissions we've already put into the atmosphere. As you know, the 2-degree target is probably what we don't want to exceed in terms of international negotiations that have been happening. And we've already used up 1 degree of that. And based on the greenhouse gases that we've already put into the atmosphere, we're already committed to another 0.6 degrees of those 2 degrees. So what's left is about 0.4 to 0.5 degrees of potential temperature rise, and that's what we have to play with. So we've already committed to 8 to 10 inches of sea level rise, and most likely ice-free summers in the Arctic, and that raises the whole problem of territory in the North Atlantic and Pacific and the North Pole, and that the greenhouse gas concentrations, in particular carbon dioxide, where the cap we've been talking about is about 450 parts per million. We're already at 390, and that number is rising by 2 to 3 parts per million per year, and that number, 2 to 3, is also increasing each year. And stabilizing our emissions is not going to reduce the overall parts per million. It's only stabilizing in the future and completely reducing those emissions, which will really cause a change. Dr. DeCicco talked about energy independence and lessons learned in the past 40 years. And basically, the problem is we haven't been able to persuade people that there's a significant I mean, I guess people have been convinced that there is a significant problem, but we need legal obligations to somehow achieve the targets that we think we need. And he actually made a very interesting point regarding the difference between energy policy and environmental policy, and we cannot view both of them under the same lens. Professor Ullman talked about local and national politics, and so he answered the question what we've done in the past 40 years since the last Earth Day, and the answer is nothing. The last major legislation was the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, and one ray of sunshine potentially is the fact that the Clean Air Act does have jurisdiction over climate change potentially, or at least that's what's being argued. So in the end, the current legislation that is potentially going to be passed from the Congress, which is either the Waxman-Markey bill or the bill that actually passed in the House, which was the Waxman-Markey bill, and the one that's being debated in the Senate, which is the Kerry Lieberman and Graham bill. Those bills will actually preempt the Clean Air Act, nuisance law, and any regional efforts that have taken place so far. So the point that he made was that if we do enact some major legislation like these bills, is that we need to somehow preserve the legal authority that we've already that we've given ourselves over the past 40 years. And that's that.
I was sitting on the Food and Health panel, which I was joined by Karen Peterson, Director of the Nutrition Program and Professor in Environmental Health Sciences, Dr. Yvette Perfecto, Professor of Ecology at the School of Natural Resources, and Eileen Spring, who's CEO and President of Food Gatherers, the Washtenaw County local food procurement agency. And I, too, am going to sort of drift away from the three major questions that were posed because our conversation was very fluid and covered all of those in different ways, and just talk about some of the themes that emerged in our discussion. So first, I think it's important to note, as someone in the group did, that we're making progress in food and health, that we've made progress over the past 40 years, and especially in Washtenaw County, there's a lot of activity around local food and healthy food, and so that's important to remember as we sort of frame the discussion. And then the different ways people can make action and make change in this area, both at an individual level and at a community level. So that's something that we talked a lot about. And the different avenues for that change. And one of them that we all thought were very important was the role of education. And so an example in the group was Agrarian Adventure going into local middle schools and talking about how to grow the food and distribute and cook the food. And so that's one avenue. And another avenue would be the role of institutions like the U of M or public schools at large. And so what are the roles of institutions in Michigan, across the country, for instituting this change? And then also, in the same line, how do we change the discussion, both in these institutions and then maybe more importantly in the funding agencies? How do we get people to recognize what's actually going to constitute some change around sustainability in food and fund the movement that will create that change? So I think a message that came out was that it's going to take the combined efforts of a local individual movement and then these sort of higher top-down sort of changes. And it will take the combination of those. So as I mentioned, also the role of institutions was something that's important. Eat Local, Eat Natural was a group in town that was represented at the panel, and they're working to try to get more food locally sourced here at the university. And so I think that that's a really good way that we could see larger change, and I think maybe the panel will talk a little bit about how the integrated assessment out of the sustainability office could offer an avenue for that change. But so it was a combination of local food discussion and how local food means healthier food a lot of the time. And so by supporting new initiatives and new farms, it will mean healthier food for people here. And then an important topic that came up, which often comes up when talking about health and food, is equity. And so how do we make sure that people across income ranges are going to have access to this new healthy local food? And Eileen Spring, who had to leave, but mentioned that food assistance had increased in Washtenaw County 138% in the last year, compared to a national average of only 40%. And so even within Washtenaw County, there are lots of people who need access to food in general, and how do we make sure that they're getting high quality, healthy food? And so I think it's important that we link these two movements of accessibility and healthy local food. There were issues debated about supply and demand and how we need to create more of both of those things, both increase the supply chain into institutions, but also create a local demand on a consumer level. And so I think related to that, we need to define some new terminology and new ways of talking about these things and new metrics for defining what healthy local food is and what it looks like. I know that Eileen at Food Gatherers struggles with, they often measure their food in poundage, but if it's pounds and pounds of soda being delivered, that's heavy compared to light fruits and vegetables. What's the message and what's the true value of the food we consume? So I think maybe the same message as 40 years ago, there are some serious structural changes that need to happen. I think the institution, the University of Michigan, is a great avenue for that change, and so I challenge the students in the room to be that link to the community that we really need. And then I challenge the university to sort of be the driving force in the county for that change, particularly around food and sourcing of local healthy food.
So now I have an opportunity to follow up on those summaries and the discussions and quiz the panel some. So are there any questions from the audience, either on cards or just raise your hand? So we'll start right here.
My question is regarding wind and solar energy. I've heard that these systems have some drawbacks, such as the greenhouse gas footprint that's involved in production of these systems. For instance, like some people said solar panels that break-even point for energy comes 11 years after you install it. So, and I've heard some of the same stuff about wind turbines. Nobody likes to have it in the backyard, so we need it. So I guess my question boils down to these rumors about it taking so long to make the payback both monetarily and the carbon sense. Is that true?
So life cycle question. Would you bring the microphone over? John?
That's a great question, and I think it points to the fact that in addressing so many of these issues, and in particular, say the energy climate one, for which things like windmills are one of the potential solutions, that there's no silver bullets and no simple answers. But I think it's important not to get hung up in, say, the life cycle question. We right now have a system, whether it's the electricity that goes into our homes or the energy sources used in the factories that make the steel, that is today not carbon constrained. So if we look at almost any life cycle, and this is what happens when we do life cycle analysis, we trace through the supply chain and we pull our hair out saying, oh my God, almost anything we do has got a bad carbon footprint. Hello? We live in a carbon constrained world. So I think the key is to focus point by point. Putting wind in Michigan to back out coal, at that point, you're getting rid of carbon. That doesn't mean we don't need to pay attention to how we're making the steel and where the steel is coming from. That steel is coming from China and it's unconstrained. We need to address that. So I think breaking the problem down, and that's where you translate the global to the local and look at what I would call in technical terms really a carbon management approach and factor in, well, we can do this here. And just because maybe we're buying parts from somewhere else, that doesn't mean we're not going to pay attention to that either.
On the other hand, I do think we need a systems approach that does look at the ramifications of the whole process. But I'd agree with John that we might, in the process, compare current life cycle experiences with, and you know, bounce off things like. So I think you're right about solar panels, right? At the moment, the amount, the plastics and the amount of technology, carbon-based technology that goes into making them does put a cost on their payback. And it's important to understand that and realize that 100% reliance on solar panels wouldn't get us out of our problem now, but it's still a comparison problem.
Yeah, I just to maybe split the difference here. You know,
As a lawyer would.
as a lawyer would.
On the one hand.
You know, we've got a carbon footprint regardless, and I think this is John's point. I mean, those coal-fired power plants have a carbon footprint in their construction that's equally as large, if not larger, than the solar panels, and then they have a continuing carbon footprint that is going to seal our fate if we don't find a way to move away from it. So I actually think the bigger issue when we're talking about energy policy, because so much in this country is driven by economics, I think the bigger question is how do we make alternative forms of energy, renewable forms of energy, which are good for America, both in terms of addressing climate and addressing sustainability issues, but also good in addressing energy independence and hopefully revitalizing our economy. Which are big ticket items as well. I think the challenge is making them more competitive. Removing, one thing we didn't talk about this morning is the oil depletion allowance, and the fact that today in America we continue to subsidize the production of the fossil fuels that will lead to our extinction. And yet we failed to provide adequate support for the alternative energy that we need to develop to have a more happier outcome. So I think we need to dramatically shift how we, what our financing is in the energy sector. Make it so, certainly putting a carbon, some kind of a carbon, either carbon tax or a cap and trade system in place would increase the price of fossil-based fuels. Ending the subsidies for fossil-based fuels would add to competitiveness, and providing greater financial incentives for the development of alternative energy. That's where I think we really need to be heading in terms of the energy policy piece of the equation.
I'd like to ask the audience if I said that there's one industry in Michigan that exports $18 billion of product a year, what would you identify that as? $18 billion a year. Billion. No, it's money. That's what we pay for our energy in Michigan, both in terms of petroleum that we import for our vehicles, in terms of coal, which generates our electricity. And so the incentive for the state of Michigan to retain $18 billion a year by becoming carbon independent, and what that means in terms of jobs, in terms of being able to fund public business, being able to fund the university, it's an immense incentive for the state. And yet we seldom hear any attention called to the economics of what it means for this state to be so reliant on the carbon-based energy.
Good responses. Yes, ma'am.
I wrote mine, but I'll read it. It seems to me, being a layperson, not a scientist, that one of the biggest obstacles to accomplishing alternative energy and getting rid of our dependence on fossil fuel is our social, behavioral, political, and public relations problem. I happen to come from Chicago, where it's common for people to own one car, one family. And we moved here 12 years ago, and I suddenly found out that every person in my family had to have a car, even my high school friends. And it was a shock. And I guess that's one thing. I understand why Michigan grew up because of the auto industry, but this problem is not just Michigan, not just Illinois, it's all over the country. How can we convince people that to get on the bandwagon? The scientists, the professors, and academia, we're all on the bandwagon and interested citizens. but public relations, I guess I'm saying, how can we change the whole country socially, behaviorally, politically, and from a PR point of view?
So actually, I'd like to paraphrase that in terms of a transportation question, since you started with, why does everybody have to have a car, and what does it mean to energy? So one of the transportation folks want to take a stab at that?
Is this alive? The answer that I would flip off the top of my head is say, cars are cool. And that's been a part of the history. And I use this example if there was the 1975 movie American Graffiti, which really at that time sort of evolved the culture around the coolness of cars. But there are some real anomalies in terms of future directions. You can make a long list of things that are funny about why we depend on cars. But the more general question, and you think about what it takes to get people's behavior, is to borrow an expression from a psychology professor friend of ours who says, if it ain't cool, people aren't going to do it. Now, maybe I'm not using the word cool in quite the right way, but the sense is of social acceptability and social preference. And people are trying to understand this. And I'll put in a pitch for a conference that's going to be held in May, 13th, 14th, and 15th, which is on consumerism. And a panel of noted behavioral psychologists are coming to town to talk about what we understand in terms of you might want to use the expression, what are our brains hardwired for? And are some of these behavioral questions that you ask about essentially part of our hardwiring? And I don't think anybody yet would claim they know the answer to that, but the exploration of it reveals some of these behavioral aspects about the way we behave, and perhaps out of that we'll gain some insights to build on, as you described, the important piece of this, which is really our social and cultural aspects of these problems. So I think you nailed a very interesting question, and in a nutshell, I would say the answer is we got to make it cool.
I think the other part of this is that cars are far too cheap, and that's sort of a weird thing to say because in a sense they're not, but we perceive it that way because the marginal cost of travelling that extra mile or making that extra trip is so ridiculously low that most people perceive it as being cheap. And all kinds of, there are all kinds of moves around the world to introduce charging, whether that's by mile, whether that's by congestion, and so on and so on. These are all attempts to kind of get the real cost in there. But what we're going to see, I think, Carl mentioned that it's all about behaviour and attitudes, but the technology will also play a big part because we're heading towards electric vehicles. We're also ultimately heading towards connected and autonomous vehicles. I think we're starting to see now with drivers, we do a lot of research on drivers, people as drivers. And they're kind of bored with driving. They want to do a lot of other things. They want to do everything but drive, but they still want to be in that vehicle. So something is going to give here, something is going to change, and the technology is going to help bring that about because they won't actually have to drive the vehicle. And once that happens, the use factors are so dramatic in increasing the amount of energy, the emissions, and also just the amount of congestion on the highways and so on, are so overpowering that to get some connectivity and some automation into the system will make a huge difference.
But I do think you really hit the nail on the head in your discussion of it. It's about behavior. We do have cars that are much more efficient, that pollute a lot less. HEVs, for example, yet about 2% of Americans drive an HEV. And when the new electric car comes out, if it ever does, I'm a little skeptical, it'll be more expensive. It'll have a $10,000 battery in it, and it's not clear, how are we going to get the even 2%?
I think also that the behavioral aspects are big, and already there's some behavior modification taking place in places where commuting time is now up to 2 hours each way. Some of the jobs in California are separated from the people who have those jobs by a 2-hour commute. Part of that, of course, is that real estate prices closer to the job are too high. Part of that is that we have a highway system that has subsidized exurbia. But the pain of spending that much time commuting is beginning to lead people to ask whether it's worth it. And add to that the pain of $5 gasoline, which some experienced for a brief period of time, and it led to a lot of rethinking about where one lives with relationship to where one works. And I think that kind of rethinking, it's a behavioral rethinking, has already been, it's getting underway, and it needs to penetrate more and more geographic regions.
You know, there's obvious connections that we've seen here between transportation and energy, but you know, transportation is more about how we move around. It's about why we move around. And one of the reasons why we move around is to get food. So I'd like to see if the food people have anything to contribute to this part of the conversation about where we grow it, how we get it, and how we get to it.
Well, I think that the summary that was provided before about the discussion in our panel addressed this issue. We talk a lot, actually. Most of the discussion in our panel was about local food. And obviously, it's all connected. It's connected with the energy, how we grow our food, energy intensive. It takes more energy to produce the food that we eat than the actual energy that we derive from that food. So, and then we also get our food from thousands of miles away. That contributes also to the energy budget of our food system. So a lot of what we talk about was how to reduce that and how to enhance our local food system so that we can have locally produced food that is healthy also and that do not have that big footprint in the environment. And it's perfectly feasible, and I think somebody earlier on mentioned with respect to energy, that technology do not necessarily solve the problem, and I think that applies a lot for food as well. The problem is not a technological problem. We know how to grow enough food in a sustainable way. And today we grow enough food to feed everybody, and there's still 1 billion people that are hungry in the world. It's not a technological issue, it's a social, political, and economic issue. And so I think that part of what we want to do here today is discuss how we can change, no? It's a matter of a political will, basically, and we need to pressure more the politicians and educate more the public so that there is more pressure to change the system, because I think everybody wants to eat healthy and everybody wants an agricultural system that do not have such a big imprint in the environment.
One connection, of course, between food and climate that focuses on the developing of public awareness. In Sweden, now every grocery item indicates what its carbon footprint is, and every time you go to a restaurant, the menu indicates your choice. There's no coercion, you still buy what you want to buy, but you become more aware of when you buy meat, what it means versus buying, vegetarian. So again, making the public aware of the interrelationships in subtle ways can lead to behavioral modification.
So I want to read one of the questions that was on a card, and then we'll go up to the audience again. And this actually brings us back to the water side here, because the question here is, how can scientists, the public, and others have a positive influence on the revision of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement? And they did it specifically in the context of invasive species, habitat, pollution, and I'll add climate change to that to see whether or not there's even something that's possible in that regard.
I like the way you volunteered me there, Alan. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is a binational agreement between the U.S. and Canada about the Great Lakes, and historically it's been about water quality, about water pollution, and it was one of the signature agreements that drove pollution levels down in the Great Lakes. When Lake Erie was advertised as being dead, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was one of the agreements that limited phosphorus and nutrient that go into Lake Erie, and back in the early 70s, and that helped Lake Erie recover. It was one of the drivers of the Clean Water Act, so it's done a lot of good in the past, and it's a very science-based agreement in that it actually set loading levels for how much pollution could go in, and those loading levels were based on what everyone thought the lakes could take. The agreement's being renegotiated today, now in the last few years, and it's going to continue. And the challenges facing the Great Lakes now are very different. Our panel talked a lot about that. It's not just pollution, but it's now invasive species. It's runoff from that's pollution that you can't control easily through pipes. It's some sewage, still some sewage flows, and historic contamination. Of course, then there's climate change, which does all sorts of nasty things to the lakes, not just lowering lake levels, but also raising temperatures in the lakes, which completely throws the ecosystem out of whack. And that's my scientific, technical interpretation. I think my colleagues who are actually scientists might have different words for that. So there's a great, if anything, right now the science needs for the Great Lakes, and as a non-scientist I can say this, are greater than ever, because the problems are much more difficult to solve. Our understanding now is the ecosystem is much more complex, and therefore we need science-based solutions to inform the policies that we're going to be trying to adopt. And chief among those policies, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, there are ways of addressing invasive species through the agreement, as well as climate change. But the agreement's a non-binding agreement, so most of those ways they're policy statements that would drive actual changes in law at the Canadian or the U.S. level down the road. So, for example, if the agreement called for ecological separation of the Great Lakes from the water bodies that are bringing in invasive species like Asian carp, that statement by the U.S. and Canadian governments would be a huge milestone and would help drive all sorts of U.S. and Canadian policy that would ultimately help the lakes. Now, we can't make that call unless the scientists are able to tell us that ecological separation is possible and what the implications would be. So there's a great deal of need for science input to the agreement. On climate change, again, the right kind of policy statement backed up by the science on climate change, on the need, on what the impacts of climate change are going to be in the Great Lakes could have enormous implications for U.S. and Canadian policy. If you can imagine the U.S. talking about the impacts of climate change based on what the scientists have documented or predict for Great Lakes water levels, for temperatures, for species, then you could also imagine some of the most difficult votes to get in the U.S. Senate being our senators, Levin and Stabenow, Voinovich, Brown, the Ohio senators, the Michigan senators, the Illinois senators, the industrial heartland senators, who also are big Great Lakes fans and champions, could really move the needle with them and help us mobilize the U.S. Congress the way the public has been mobilized on climate change. So, long answer.
Okay, so question from the audience? I think you were up there first, yep.
I want to return to the subject of behavior change briefly. I actually was just when I thought you stole my question, but it rejected. Because we've already discussed how a lot of the sustainability problems are people problems. And another theme that I heard emerge from the 4 panel discussions was that there's a need for coordination among our efforts. And given that there is an apparent challenge in gathering
So for those of you in the back that might not have heard that, the essence of the question is, how do we mobilize people and go collective action, perhaps like was happening in the 70s, that we don't seem to have happening right now, to mobilize around these complex questions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think we have great opportunities in this area. I was reading a newspaper the other day, and there's these ads for iPhones and new iPhone apps. And I was struck, you can get like an iPhone app that has your Pantone colors on it. Has anyone seen these ads? I think it's, the apps might be $4.99 or something like that. And that app will, let you select your paint. And instead of having to schlep, a bunch of paint samples or something like that, you can put it up on your screen. And those kinds of tools, if we begin to apply them, and this is stuff that we could start to do, any of us, to empower people to make those decisions. Sweden has a law on carbon footprints in food, Henry says. Well, why can't we call that up on an Android or an iPhone? Part of something I did, I created a green car rating system over 10 years ago. We launched it in 1998, ACEEE's Green Book. There's a version of it up on Yahoo Autos. That's the Web 1.0 version. You have to go to the website, call it up, search for it. That kind of, what's the green car rating to empower the choices? Why not put that on this new mobile web thing? So there's a lot that can be done to empower local action and better choices on any of these dimensions if we put our minds to it. And I'm optimistic that can be done.
I want to take your question and bring it home a little better. Does the University of Michigan really care about these issues? I'm not so sure. Is there a crisis? Yes. A real crisis? Well, we had a crisis with the football team. We took care of it, okay?
We still have that.
I mean, Henry talked today about, in the middle of in the next 30, 40 years, we're going to lose the Andean glaciers. The water supply in that part of the region will have serious problems. Is climate change something that we might have a nice, quiet teach-in about? Or is it something that we should be much more proactive and feel it more deeply, make it part of what this university is? I really would like, the university is doing some great things. Planet Blue, for example, rocks, right? And going from building to building, showing how to make changes that make a difference. We've had some cluster hires on sustainability and energy. The president has put Don Scabia in charge of the Graham Institute and the Graham Sustainability, and these are steps. But to me, they're not capturing the real crisis of the essence of the crisis. Look at 40 years ago, Michigan was a leader in environmental concerns. We can't claim that anymore. And President Coleman, Provost Hanlon, Vice President Forrest, they could do something about this. University encourages parking far more than they encourage bicycle riding and my bike gets wet in the rain. My car is dry. If we spend as much money on some of our athletic programs as we spent on, if we spent as much money on bringing more university academic leaders into the university who care about sustainability issues, that would be a great start. If students took sustainability teaching and when they started classes here so they knew it was really important, that would make a difference. But I'm not, it's sort of like, okay, if the university canceled classes and made the teaching something that had the stamp of approval that this really counts, it would be something. But, this is a start, but I would like I would like to feel that the administration feels the real sense of crisis and the opportunity to make the University of Michigan the place where it happens.
I'd like to add, as a scientist, a piece of data to Carl's observation. Why are there so few people here? Maybe they're all going to watch this on the internet.
On their app.
But, I mean, it's a reflection of the response to how do we, the original question is, how do we get people to be interested? The observation is something is amok in just a reflection of who has made this a priority.
Well, I think it's a great question, Rachel, that you asked about how do we inspire collective action, and being of the baby boomer generation, it seemed like it just happened. I mean, you woke up in the morning and there was a demonstration you needed to show up at, or occasionally a riot, and I kid you not, and it is a mystery. I do know that the student advocates for nutrition at the School of Public Health who were at the earlier forum had to run back to class, and one person didn't go to work for the first 2 hours today. So we should probably make it a university-wide event next year that is facilitated for students. But at any rate, one thing we're trying, so I do work in schools with youth to reduce obesity and increase awareness of food, activity, that all affect energy balance at a level of individual health. But one thing we're trying with Professor Mark Zimmerman, who is our chair of health education and health behavior, expert in something called psychological empowerment theory. And what we're trying to do is, we know that when youth and adults are effective in changing behavior, it actually is related most strongly to what we call self-efficacy or confidence. But what we're trying to do in this current model that we have a proposal out on is actually use psychological empowerment in youth, but link it to their community engagement and involvement. It's through a model called Free the Children, I believe, Free the Kids, something like that. So we're trying to see whether we can get kids who are middle schoolers to be more actively engaged in their communities as a way of building their own confidence around health and well-being. And in literature and research that's been done on reducing violence, other risky behaviors in youth, this model actually works. So what we're trying to bring it to is food, health, and reduction of obesity. So I realize that sounds a bit esoteric, but we're trying to build collective action into how we teach young kids to care for themselves and value food and health. So.
Let me just add three quick things. First of all, I think one of the challenges on climate and on energy and on sustainability in general is that although it's a huge crisis, it's a problem that if we fail to take it on over the next decade, we seal our fate. The harms are down the road, or the worst harms are down the road. And I just, I think we have a hard time in this country, and maybe just as people, we have a hard time dealing with problems that aren't staring us right in the face with the effects visited upon us immediately. So we deal well with immediate crises. We do well in, an earthquake happens and everybody wants to help in Haiti and everybody wants to help in Chile, and that's certainly the right response. But this is a harder one. I think it's harder for us because those calamitous effects will happen, but they may not happen in the lifetimes of anybody up on the stage right now. I mean, they may, they're going to be visited upon our children and our grandchildren. So I think that's one part of the problem. But in terms of how we engage, notwithstanding that, I mean, I feel a little more hopeful than everybody else in terms of certainly where this generation of students is, even though they're not here today. And I'm going to go with the fact that they're either in class, it's too early, or it's cold and wet out. But I think one of the reasons a lot of us are working on these issues and doing it in a university setting is the sense that this next generation of students is the answer to these problems. And I do think there's a greater level of awareness in this generation, certainly than there was in ours. And I do think we're seeing some changes in behavior. I mean, I was at a water conference in Marquette last month, and I asked for a show of hands in the room about a few things, and some of the answers weren't so great, like how many people owned a hybrid only a few hands went up. How many people composted? A few more. How many people recycled? Everybody in the room raised their hand. And that's a big and significant change. Maybe it's just working around the edges and we need to do a whole lot more, but I think it's with those changes, even at an individual level, even at a small level, that we chip away at this problem. And I actually think we need to promote that, because I think part of the reason there may be a lack of full action on this problem is it does seem a little overwhelming. And so I think knowing that the little things we can all do in our daily lives make a difference is really really important. And then the third and final thing I'll just say quickly, and it's not a plug for the law school or for the legal system, which fails us in a lot of ways, but I do think, and John talked about this in our panel discussion, I do think we need some legal regimes that institutionalize some of the behavior we're trying to seek. So we can do a lot as individuals, we can do a lot as groups, we can promote culture change. That's really important. There should be some binding legal requirements on industry in America and on agriculture in America, where there's almost none right now in this area, and even on all of us. And that should be part of our social compact. And we need representatives in Washington and our state legislatures who have the principle and the confidence to actually enact those laws. That may be the hardest part of all, but that does need to be part of that collective action solution.
Your first point and your third point are quite connected. I mean, the great environmental statutes that were passed in the 70s were in response to crises. We don't have them in quite the way we had them back then, so it's hard to get the legal regimes. Peter, do you have a...
Yeah, I just wanted to say, when the question was asked, I was kind of collective action. I grew up in Australia, and we didn't use that term. We used to say hit the streets or something. But I thought the context that I've got here is that we also need to work across the lines. We've had 4 groups here talking about sustainability, transportation, water quality, food, and so on, energy. And I think one of the problems is that we don't know enough about all these other areas. I mean, we're all talking about the same issue, but then immediately we kind of break off into this piece or that piece. And I think one of the problems too is that we're kind of scared of saying something stupid or assuming something stupid about these other areas, because these are quite complex in terms of life cycle analysis and so on. You don't really understand what's important in energy, or you don't really understand what's important in food if you're thinking about transportation. So I think the collective action also applies to all these disciplines that we've got here, that we all need to understand a lot more, in a lot more depth about, and subtlety about what the other issues are in these other areas for sustainability, because it's one issue. Today we've tried to bring it together, but it's probably a good start, but there's a lot to be done.
Actually, that's a good end. It's noon. We're supposed to be ending now, and I think that actually was a quite wonderful way to end, because it's sort of the way we started, in that the problems we're dealing with now are just as difficult, just as urgent as they were 40 years ago. They're just a lot more complicated. And what someone in one of the breakouts said, the problems we have now are much more complicated, much more complex. We need complex solutions. I'd like to challenge that, and as you leave, think about, are there simple solutions to these complicated problems? If we were to think about water, transportation, food, and energy as a complex, complicated set, are there simple threads through that? And perhaps the behavioral changes we're talking about, and maybe the responsibility of individuals and how they push a responsibility of institutions, maybe as sort of a simple underlying way to move forward on that. So with that, I want to thank the panelists for coming. And I want to thank you for coming, and please tell somebody what this was about so we can share what happened today. Thank you.